Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm joined by Nick.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about some video games you might enjoy if you like particular books.
I think the reason we thought this would be interesting to do is that you've kind of got into video games, playing video games with me in the last sort of year, 18 months. And I think probably for a lot of people who maybe haven't been particularly interested in video games growing up, you're kind of aware of like the sort of big blockbuster video games like Fortnite or Call of Duty, but you might not be aware of some of the more sort of slightly more niche, like story-focused or puzzle-focused games, which are things that we like to play together. And actually, a lot of those we thought paired quite well with some of our favourite books, so we thought we'd do a video game book pairing for people who might want to dip their toe into a different medium. Video
games, like novels, have a lot of different genres, and I think definitely over the past year and a bit I have discovered the genre of video games that I like. And there are, some really fun story-led, story-driven puzzle kinds of video games that I've really enjoyed and that have definitely made me think of particular books. Usually when we play video games together, you are controlling the characters and I am helping with the puzzles and the story, because I'm not very good at navigating 3D space. So these are not necessarily multiplayer games, but they are games that you can play as a team.
I think pretty much every game we're going to be talking about is designed to be played on your own, but they are mainly sort of puzzle games, so there's no reason why you can't play with someone else and work out the puzzles together. It's just that one person will be holding the controller or sort of moving the mouse around.
The first game we wanted to recommend was the Seance of Blake Manor, which we think you would enjoy if you like Agatha Christie. And the specific book we had in mind was The Hollow by Agatha Christie, which we read last year, I think. Yeah, and really enjoyed. The Hollow is a country house murder mystery where Poirot is trying to work out exactly what happened. He arrives at a scene that looks almost like it's been staged. Someone is holding a gun over her dead husband, but did she really do it? And everything kind of goes on from there. It's a really strong Poirot, we thought.
Yeah, the Seance of Blake Manor, you play as a detective who is called from Dublin at the 1897, I want to say.
I think so. It's the late 1890s, yeah.
Very end of the 19th century. Is called away from Dublin to the west coast of Ireland to a country house called Blake Manor, to investigate the disappearance of a guest.
And at Blake Manor, this is a big old country sort of aristocratic house that has been converted into a hotel, and at the end of the weekend there is going to be a massive seance where they are going to try and summon the dead. And so all of the guests in the hotel are sort of here for the seance, and are involved in sort of the spiritualist movement in some way, I guess. The game is a sort of combination of a sort of Agatha Christie detective whodunit. You're sort of ticking off suspects and, gaining clues, but there's also a very heavy gothic, almost horror element, which I thought was done really, really well.
Yeah, it's quite an unnerving game. I wouldn't say it's properly horror, but there are certainly unsettling sequences. The gameplay really involves wandering around the manor and investigating sort of objects that might look out of place.
Talking to the guests and the suspects.
It's got quite an involved system of, as you sort of speak to people or find things around the house, it puts things on basically a big digital corkboard where you can draw connections between them and sort of interrogate the sort of different things you can infer from what you've learned, and then everything sort of subdivided into different mysteries, sort of mini mysteries that lead you towards the main mystery. And as you get enough information, you will be given the opportunity to say what you think has happened, sort of drawing from the information you've gathered from the guests. I would say that is probably one of the weaker elements of the game, in that it's a little bit frustrating. So I think sometimes you can have all the information you need to know exactly what's going on, but because you haven't found one of the clues that the game thinks that you need, you can't solve that puzzle yet.
Yeah, there's not much space for you to make leaps of logic, even when there are logical leaps to make. While some of the game mechanics weren't perfect, I think the story was really good. The atmosphere was top-notch, really, really good. And the sort of creepy gothic elements were done very, very well.
Yes. I think also, if we're talking about things that didn't work quite as well, and you might want to speak to this a bit more than me, I'm not sure that all of the sort of text, the sort of characters' sort of speech was entirely consistent with what would have been said in the late 19th century.
Oh yes, the dialogue was sometimes really modern, but also sometimes like too old-fashioned, and it was obviously not written by someone who had familiarised themselves massively with late 19th century ways of speaking. I will say though that like, while playing it, that did actually quite bother me, but I had completely forgotten that when we were talking about it just now. Like, that isn't a lasting error that stayed with me. Like, I feel like it just needed a good edit from someone who knew about the 19th century.
I would say, as someone who is much less sort of plugged into 19th century stuff, I noticed it a lot less than you did.
Yeah.
But there were still points I was like, that doesn't seem quite right. But I wouldn't say it usually really damaged the scene or the dialogue.
No.
Just talking about sort of logistics, particularly if you're not someone who plays a lot of games, I think it's reasonably easy to control. We played it with a controller plugged into our laptop, but you can also just use a mouse and keyboard.
Yeah, which I think would probably be very
which to be honest would actually be easier. It's reasonably self-explanatory. What you need to do, it doesn't rely on you sort of understanding the language of games. It's quite lengthy, I think. What would you say, about 20 hours?
I don't know if it was quite that long, but yeah, it's a decent length game. It has a sort of time mechanic. So looking at objects and talking to people takes up time, and there are certain hours of the day, and that sort of adds to the tension.
Time is a resource that you spend.
Yeah.
So interacting with something or talking to someone will take out a finite amount of the time you have
in your day.
I would say if you enjoy a country house mystery, it's definitely worth giving a go.
Yeah, there were two other books we had picked out which it also made us think of. So the book that it made me think of quite a lot was The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton, which I know you haven't read, but this is a really interesting murder mystery time loop where every day that the narrator wakes up in a different character's body and is trying to solve the mystery of what happens in this big country house. And the Seance of Blake Manor really reminded me of The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. The person who has disappeared in Blake Manor is called Evelyn, and I don't know if it was a nod to Evelyn Hardcastle or not, but there were quite a few elements of it that made me think of this book, and I think especially the sort of, trying to figure out what everyone is doing here, what everyone's motivation is, while also like not trying to necessarily give away too much about yourself. Like that made me think quite a lot of this book, and I think if you enjoyed this book you'd probably enjoy The Seance of Blake Manor.
I would say what this reminds me of is the Sherlock Holmes story The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle, because I think it's got that same sort of investigation into sort of supernatural but with a sort of more irrational approach. Albeit they probably come out in slightly different places. I think it would also be worth checking out if you're particularly interested in sort of Irish history. There's quite a lot about Irish folklore and also about the sort of English colonisation of Ireland as well. The sense of a land that's a bit haunted by its past, which is quite interesting.
And in general, if you're interested in sort of 19th century spiritualism and different approaches to spiritualism, that was something I found really interesting in it as well, as someone who does find that like really historically interesting. Yeah. So the next pairing we have for you is if you enjoy the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers, you might really enjoy the game Tacoma. So the Wayfarer series is a really great science fiction series. I've read 3 of them. Have you read 3 or have you read 4?
I've read 3, I haven't read the 4th yet.
We're working our way through very slowly. And it's a really great series with a really interesting world. It's sort of, far in the future, science fiction, but very sort of character driven, and in the first book in the series, A Long Way to a Smaller Angry Planet, you're following a crew on their way to a planet and sort of all of the dynamics between them, and then the second book in the series is this one, which is my favourite. Your favourite too? Yeah, which is about an AI who has gained a body, sort of exploring what it means to be alive, and it's just marvellous in every way. And then Tacoma is a really great story-driven game that we played a month or 2 ago. You played it before, hadn't you?
I played it before, so we played it together. So you are a private contractor who has been sent by an international corporation to retrieve an AI from a space station where a disaster has unfolded. So when you arrive on the space station, the first thing you do is plug into their systems and discover that the space station records the movements and activities of all crew members. And while the data's corrupted, you can, in effect, recreate or sort of bring back certain scenes that you can watch through.
So you're almost going around the ship watching memories that have been recorded, and slowly you begin to understand what happened on this ship. The gameplay is limited, like it's mostly a story-driven game, like you're mostly just watching the story unfold and going around and like discovering objects that the crew left behind and sort of what that tells you about them as people and about the world they inhabit. But I really, really enjoyed Tacoma. I think it's a really interesting science fiction game with great world building, really interesting themes, really good relationships, and the sort of slow unfolding of what happened was done really, really well.
Yeah, it's a very well told story. I think it's one of the things interesting about video games is sometimes if you were to look at the story, if you were to put it in a non-interactive medium, it would probably feel a bit thin. But I think in an interactive setting, when you sort of uncover it for yourself, it's quite compelling. It's really well voice acted as well, so it's got it's got a very strong cast. It's an interesting sort of sci-fi take on some reasonably current issues, I would say. It's
quite a quick, contained game. Like Blake Manor was quite long, but Tacoma probably only takes you like 5 hours to play, I guess.
I would say that if you're doing everything, there's a lot of reasonably optional stuff that you don't really need to do.
So just finding the cat in every scene.
Yeah, if you're digging into all of that, it wouldn't take you more than 8 hours max.
Yeah. It's one of those video games that takes you about the same amount of time to play as it would to read a book, which is not the same for all video games. But I would say that like Blake Manor was probably like a 4-star game, but Tacoma's a 5-star game. Like really, really, really good.
I'd probably put it as a 4-star game. But,
I loved Tacoma. And to kind of return to the Becky Chambers comparison, I think the reason why I sort of put those two together is partly because they are both sort of character-driven science fiction, but I think some of the themes that Tacoma looks at also feel very akin to the kind of themes that Becky Chambers likes to explore.
Soft and hopeful sci-fi.
Yeah. Well, there are some unhopeful things in Tacoma too, but I think it, has hope at its core in a way that just works really well.
The characters are written by someone who isn't a misanthrope.
Yeah. Which is, I think, probably the same for Becky Chambers' books as well.
Yeah. So the next game book pairing we've got is His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, and the game we're pairing this with is Myst. So this is the subtle knife, but we're sort of pairing the whole trilogy, which follows the adventures of Lyra Balakra, who is a child from a world that is different to ours, who ends up going on a sort of multi-world, multi-universe spanning adventure, which deals with some quite deep philosophical themes. And there's a lot about travel between different sort of worlds and realities. So the game we're pairing it with is a game called Myst. So Myst was originally released a very long time ago, back in 1993.
Not a very, very long time ago.
It's quite a long time
in
ago.
Game terms, a very long
this
time
is
ago.
This is an ancient text for the medium of video games. And the premise of Myst is that you play as a nameless protagonist who finds a book with a moving picture of an island in it. And when you touch the island, you're transported there with no way back to where you came from, and you have to work out what the hell is going on.
The original version of Myst was a point-and-click adventure, but it has been remastered and re-released in a way where you couldn't properly interact with the 3D space and walk around.
We played it in the new version. I think both of us had played some of the old version as children.
Kids,
I wouldn't necessarily say one's better than the other. I think some of the world is probably more intelligible in the new version because the sort of quality of the graphics is higher. It's more obvious what things are. But equally, it is a bit easier to get lost as to what you're supposed to be looking at because in the original Myst, there were only certain screens you could look at. The premise of Myst, yes, you have to solve a series of puzzles to sort of get to the bottom of what's going on, how you've ended up on this island, and who the mysterious people trapped in books in the libraries are.
And the further you get into the world, and the more you explore and solve more puzzles, you read bits of notebooks and diaries left behind and get to learn more about these worlds and what connects them and sort of what's going on. And the story is really fun. And the puzzles are generally really fun. There's one or two that are a bit tricky, but for the most part, Myst was really enjoyable.
Yes, I would say that Myst is definitely worth a go. if you've been stuck on a puzzle for half an hour, I wouldn't be too afraid to Google the solution, or at least Google a hint.
Yeah.
Some of them are hard, and then some of them are just not massively well designed from like a modern perspective, and you just won't. You might just not get it, which is fine. But it's a really interesting sort of way of delivering a story, and it's still quite unique.
Yeah, and it tackles some sort of difficult, complex questions about morality, I suppose, which is one of the reasons that made us think about it in connection to his Dark Materials.
There's some quite interesting stuff in there, and yeah, I'd definitely say it's worth checking it.
Yeah, and in Myst you sort of end up travelling between different worlds, and the worlds have very different atmospheres and appearances, and that's a really fun element of it too. And that sort of movement between different worlds definitely makes me think of his Dark Materials, which very much has that as part of it as well.
Yeah, I think sort of in the lingo of the game they're called ages, but there's like a mechanical age. I think there's a Charmwood is one of the ages, which is like a sort of flooded woodland. Like there's a lot of different aesthetics. It's also got cracking music, I have to say. So the final book we've chosen in our book game pairing is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which is a book about a mysterious house and its seemingly sort of sole or nearly sole inhabitant.
You're following a character called, or who refers to himself as Piranesi, and he lives in a world made up of halls, and he moves between these halls, making notes and finding things and speaking to the one other person that he has ever met. And something is quite odd in Piranesi. It's clear that something strange is going on. You're not quite sure what. And the further you get into the book, the more you begin to understand exactly what's happening, who Piranesi is, what's going on, what this place is, etc. And it's a very atmospheric, bizarre, wonderful book where you sort of don't know what's going on for quite a long time, but in a very satisfying way.
And the game we're pairing this with is a game called Laurel-ai and the Laser-Eyes, which is also a game where you don't know what's going on for a very long time.
In a wonderful way.
In a wonderful way. So Laurel-ai and the Laser-Eyes is a puzzle game, like Myst, but better.
So much better. The best game that we're mentioning today, and that I've ever played, hands down. The game that got me into games.
The sort of setting for Laurel-ai and the Laser-Eyes, you play a woman called Laurel-ai, and you have been invited to a hotel in Italy to meet with a director to discuss a collaboration. You're an artist. And the game starts with you arriving in the woods outside the hotel and making your way in. But as you sort of get to the hotel and explore, it becomes apparent that everything is a little bit off-kilter. There's
no one else there. The rooms are full of strange things. Lots of rooms are locked and you have to try and get into them. Time is weird and space is weird and there's lots of strange things happening. And it's both a really fantastic puzzle game where the puzzles are really, really interesting, really, really challenging and clever and varied, but also you have access to multiple puzzles at once, so if there's one puzzle you can't solve you can go and do another puzzle. But also, like, thematically and story wise, it's just fantastic. Like, the themes are really, really interesting, and the story which slowly unfolds, and the slow understanding you have of what exactly is going on and what this game is about is just so well done and so clever.
What would you say it's about? I suppose it's about sort of memory and regret. And
yeah, memory is definitely a massive theme. Art, I guess, is a theme, and sort of creative expression. Film and the sort of film industry.
It's also quite interested in video games and the history of video games. And if anyone has played, for instance, sort of Resident Evil, it's got a particularly strong relationship with that game, not really from a themes or gameplay perspective, but just from a sort of aesthetic.
I was just going to say, the aesthetic is really great. It's like mostly black and white with occasional red. And the sort of look of it, the atmosphere, the music is all very sinister and tense. Not in a horror way, really, but just in a, like, everything's a bit weird way.
I'd say it's quite creepy.
Yeah.
I'd say in its way it's as creepy as Blade Manor, but...
Yeah, it probably is.
If you are only going to try one of the games on this list, this is probably the one to try. It's the best one, definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
It is, I would say, reasonably difficult as a puzzle game. It took us quite a while to do.
Not in terms of, like, gameplay, but in terms of like difficult puzzles.
Yeah, and I think we did have to Google the solution to one problem as well.
Yeah, it was probably made easier by having 2 people playing.
Yes, so I think there are probably some potential frustrations, but it's like Katie says, it's immaculately well designed with sort of an excellent aesthetic and look. If it gets you, it will really get you.
Yeah, so Nick started playing it on his own, and I came into the room and watched like 3 minutes of you playing it, and then sat down, and then we played the whole game together. That's what happened. Because it was just so cool, and I just also wanted to play it. And since then we played a lot of video games together, but this was the one that like got me into playing video games. And I just thought it was fantastic.
Wrapping up, what would you say to people who enjoy books but may not play a lot of video games as to why they should check out these games or some different games?
Well, I think
as a recent convert,
I think one of the things I really enjoy about playing video games is that they are very innovative in storytelling. Obviously, some video games, like, the story is not really important. I think there are some video games which are more like sport, you know. But there are a lot of video games that are very, very story-driven. And when a video game is very story-driven, it's often using very different tools, or some of the same tools, but some different tools to a novel to tell a story. And I find that really interesting. And I think as someone who's also a writer and like interested in how we tell stories, I find the way video games tell stories to be very, very interesting. You know, especially a sort of exploration video game like Laurel-ai, for example. To a certain extent, you can be experiencing different bits of the game in different order, and therefore like how the story has to be told in order to make sense in potentially different orders, or with you finding certain bits of information out at a different point. Like, that stuff is really interesting. The variation in storytelling is something I find really interesting, but also video games are really interactive, which is really fun. And I think especially like we play video games together, and that's really nice. We also like listen to audiobooks together, which is a slightly more sociable way of reading, but in terms of like socially enjoying a story together, video games are really good for that and have been really fun for that. Certainly like a game like Laurel-ai, I think about as often and in a similar way to the novels that I love. Thematically and story-wise, even though it was a puzzle game where what I also really enjoyed about it was playing the puzzles. Like, when I think back to it, I'm mostly thinking about the story and the themes and the things that the game had to say, in a way I would look back on a novel as well.
I think the thing about Laurel-ai is it's not just a puzzle game, it's also a game where you have to deduce what's going on. Like, there's an overarching puzzle.
Yeah.
And a lot of books try and do similar things.
Yeah.
But I think, like you just said, books can only actually present you with the information in one order, whereas in Laurel-ai and in the other games as well, like, you play a detective and you are deducing things that have happened, and your exploration of the sort of narrative is quite unique to you, and it's a very active way of engaging with a mystery. And video games are actually extremely potent at that kind of deductive gameplay.
Yeah.
The other thing that games are sort of quite interesting for is that it's quite different to read about a choice that a character is making and to sort of be an active part in making that choice for a character. Most games are quite limited in the extent to which they can let your choices influence the plot, because otherwise they'd have to make 2 different games. But even when it's just a reasonably light bit of flavour, so someone does something in a particular way or something small changes, being an active part of that is quite different. And I don't know if many of the games we've talked about today really explore that in a huge amount of detail. Maybe Blade Manor to an extent. And sort of the way the story in Blade Manor unfolds is basically the same however you play the game. But the sort of specifics and like how different characters might feel about everything,
and which subplots you engage with, like, that can differ.
Can be quite different. You are sort of an active force in how your version of that story unfolds, which is also quite different. It's not something a book can do. And I think while you get lots of limitations in video game stories that books don't have to deal with, you do also get that extra space to play around with, which can be really interesting. Yeah,
like, I definitely feel like as a writer as well as a reader, I really like playing video games because I feel like they are very, like, they give you a lot of different storytelling techniques, and like teach you quite a lot about like immersion and engagement, which I find very like academically interesting as well as just fun. They do equally have lots of problems, like in the fact that everyone has to write everything down and sort of left random notes that they would definitely have destroyed in convenient places for you to uncover.
Exactly.
But that's, it's fine.
There are a surprising number of people who have written their evil plan in a diary in video games, because otherwise there's no easy way to convey that. And that's maybe a little bit unfair, and the best games get around that to a certain
and obviously
extent,
there's any novel in a diary form or a story within a story has to suspend your disbelief to a certain extent. There's always that in media, I suppose, in fiction. I would say probably if you are completely new to video games, maybe Tacoma is like a good place to start, because it's quite short, it's quite contained, it's very story led, and you're mostly just moving around interacting with the story, really. So that, in a way, is probably the easiest place to start. Like, I would say Laurel-ai is the best game. Like, I loved Laurel-ai so much, but it probably is a bit trickier. Whereas Tacoma is not a difficult game. I would say that's probably my introductory game recommendation would probably be Tacoma.
And I think, generally speaking, if you are looking to explore sort of video games, there's sort of two sort of categories to look out for are probably puzzle games and what's sometimes called walking simulators, or I suppose visual novels, which are a slightly different beast, but they are the ones that are most interested in story. I think puzzle games are some of my favourites, but actually it's, we've played quite a lot of more story focused games which are more like almost like an interactive film, basically.
So those are our video game and book pairings. We have played lots of other video games we've enjoyed, so we might do another one of these sometime. We're not sure. But yeah, do let us know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, played any of these games, if you have any similar pairing recommendations. And otherwise, that's all for now, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.